All right. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I can still remember very vividly when the center, when ZeMKI was actually established. I think I happened to be a dean at the time, but I was very happy there was a sort of a similar center than all the activities we did at the time at the University of Amsterdam, where I was then a dean. Well, it's 20 years later and the landscape has changed tremendously. I don't have to tell you that because most of you here in this hall are experts. But, you know, the way that we're dealing with digital media and communication and information technologies these days is very different from what it used to be. And I will talk a little bit more today about how that landscape changed, but particularly I will look into the future because I think the theme of this conference is also looking into the future. And I would like to start with a few imaginative journeys. Starting with this one, figure this. You enter a village square where participation in discussion is only permitted after you have signed in and paid a fee. You would never accept that in real life, you know, going on this market square, having to pay a fee. Well, on the internet, that's exactly what you do. You know, if you go to Facebook or to WhatsApp or to Instagram, to TikTok, Twitter or X, you know, those are the major gatekeepers to all of our online communication that we used to have on the market square, on public town square. And sure, you don't pay an entrance fee on Twitter or on Facebook, but you do pay with your data. You actually sign away your right to control your information and metadata, which are then monetized by the gatekeepers. And here's another imaginative journey. Imagine you walk through your neighborhood, as I sometimes do, and you see a sign attached to a school that reads, "This public school is supported by Google or by Microsoft or by Apple." And this is not imaginary. You know, just last year in my country, Google serviced almost 70% of all primary schools, providing more or less Chrome laptops, you know, and those are loaded with Google software, including Google Classroom. I will come back to that example in a short while. So public schools pretty much have become dependent on private technical infrastructures, and those also shape pedagogical needs. Another journey. Figure you walk into a public library and a sign says, "All information you can find here is filtered by 2 librarians in this building." You would think that would be a little strange, but on the internet, that's simply what happens. Google Search and Scholar, which most of you are probably using, Microsoft Bing, they are the gatekeepers to all of our online information, and their search engines account for pretty much 97% of all of our online searches in Europe. That's a lot. Personally, I use DuckDuckGo, but that only, I think, adds up to 1% of all the online searches in Europe. So, yet another example is this. Imagine the public highway system infrastructure would be owned and operated by 4 private companies who each exploit their own roads and charge toll if you enter, but they also charge exit fees when you leave. And by the way, you're not allowed to take your luggage with you from one part of the system to another. Can you imagine? Well, that's exactly what we do when we talk about cloud services. American hyperscalers, they exploit their data centers on their own conditions. So what you do is, well, sometimes you don't even pay a very low entrance fee, but you pay a hefty fee, an exit fee upon departure. And by the way, you cannot take your data, you know, with you straight to another hyperscaler because they're not interoperable. You can actually set the conditions to do that, but you need to do that upon signing before you enter. A lot of institutions don't know that yet. Okay, now I get a very interesting, I get a message from Nextcloud on my computer. They're probably listening in, right? So I have to click that away, but it's a little funny. So if I say like 5 companies, you know, govern the global distribution of your water and air, you should take this very metaphorically. You know, our water and our air are still common resources and they're governed as public utilities. But if air and water were the equivalents of data and algorithms, we could safely say that the storage and the distribution of these vital resources are controlled by a handful of tech corporations, including those 5: Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. Well, rather than being common goods, data and algorithms are processed as privatized resources. So even though users like you and me are the prime generators of the data on which particularly AI can function, we are, primarily the generators of those resources. So what are my concerns and what will I be talking about in these lectures? Of course, these were imaginative journeys, but my concerns are very real. The first one is that public spaces are turned into private digital environments. And my second concern is that public values in democracies are controlled by proprietary digital infrastructures. And these are the 3 questions that I will address over the next, I have 40 minutes, but I hope to address them all. What is the impact of dominant big tech platforms and infrastructures on European societies? My second question will go into public values. What are they in platform societies? And particularly, who are the actors who you can enact those public values? And finally, I will come to the European level and ask what EU data, the civil society and the state can do to govern digital societies and protect European democracies. So that will be, the content of today's lecture. And I will start with the first theme on digital platforms and infrastructures. And now, I've used this slide. Some of you may recognize it because I've used it for 7 years. And actually, that's historically interesting because only now, it sort of stirs more interest than it did 7 years ago, which I thought was pretty interesting. But, recently, some people, including the Trump administration, really helped me a lot to put this on the agenda. There are basically two platform ecosystem in the world, and that online world is driven by platforms and fueled by data flows. On the left-hand side, you see all the American platforms that are dominating pretty much our European system as well. Alphabet, Google, Amazon, Meta, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and I've added X because it's become such an important system. How many of you in this room have not used any of these platforms over the past week? No hands? Not really a single one? Oh, there's one. Okay. Why? Where's the hand? I can't see it because of the light. You were on vacation in some kind of, like Iceland or, any kind of, or a territory where you can't receive Wi-Fi. Well, the point, of course, is everyone in Europe is almost very dependent on these platforms. There's also on your right-hand side, the Chinese systems. And that ecosystem is controlled not so much by companies, but by the state, who then controls the 4-5 companies that I list here. Baidu, ByteDance, of course, is the owner of TikTok. Alibaba, the Chinese Amazon, Tencent operates WeChat, and Huawei, which is the operator of infrastructure, telecom infrastructure mostly. So global ecosystems are either steered by companies or by states, or as I would prefer to say, they're merging states and companies in doing so. Now, what makes these two systems differ from each other? Well, interestingly, they're ideologically far apart, but they're also mirroring each other. In the American systems, data are owned and exploited by corporations, the 5 corporations that I listed. We talk about in that system about corporate surveillance. And that corporate surveillance is grounded in the ideology of surveillance capitalism or libertarian capitalism, if you prefer so. The Chinese system, on the other hand, data are owned by the state. Citizens and corporations are subject to state surveillance. And of course, that whole system is grounded in the ideology of state capitalism. You can discuss, those terms. I'll be happy to do that, but not today, because my talk today will be about those 2 letters in between the 2 global systems, EU, the European Union, and what role does the European Union have being squeezed between those two systems, between the US and China. And then realizing that we are, in Europe, are mostly dependent on the American platform ecosystem. So my simple question is, how dependent are European societies on American big tech platforms and infrastructures? And my answer is very simple. Very dependent. Those two words, period. I could finish my lecture here because all of you probably know that that's already the case. But I would like to dive a little deeper into that question and analyze how have they become dependent, and especially how can they become less dependent on those systems, right? Over the past 5 years, and I just told you that I started with this team at least 7 or 8 years ago, but 5 years ago, there were really a few wake-up calls that have reminded people of how dependent they have become on those systems. The first was, of course, the emergence of COVID-19 pandemic that really very much increased our dependency on big tech, particularly in schools. We all had to start teaching online. Their margins went up tremendously and we became a lot more dependent. Secondly, on the technical side, there was since 2023, the emergence of ChatGPT, generative AI was tremendously enhancing the power, particularly of Microsoft in that respect, but also Google and other big tech companies, particularly the owners of hyperscalers, which owns the compute power that goes into training AI. And finally, politically, you see the picture, that has been used now very often, and I hate the picture, but basically the arrival of the Trump administration has really turned up, the emergency of this whole dependency question. So what we have seen since is that market and state powers, which used to be, still identifiable as separate things, they're now, powers that have almost completely merged. And that used to count for the Chinese system, but now it's also, very apparent in the American system. Tech bros were at the Trump's inauguration, and they're really in bed with each other as far as it comes to exercising power. And that, of course, goes at the expense of European values. Now, my next question will be, if we have this big dependence on American big tech systems, how can you explain that? And more technically, you can explain that by using the metaphor of the stack. The stack and how it operates as a closed, interdependent system of platforms that I would like to compare to a lasagna. I will talk about lasagna first, and then I will go into spaghetti, okay? So, lasagna, we have 3 basic layers. 3 types of cloud-based platforms that are offered to you as a service. First, you will find, the deeper structure, the digital infrastructure. That is everything from devices, my laptop, hardware devices, all the way down to chips, to data centers that, your data are running on or stored, to cables, but also even the way deep down to mineral resources. I've written on this extensively, so I will give you references later on. On top of that, you have the gatekeeping platforms, and those are pretty much referring to cloud services, app stores, social media networks, mail services, identification services, very important, search engines, online advertising, operating systems, etc., etc. There are a lot more, but this is the middle layer of gatekeeping. And then finally, the software that you're interfacing with, is the software that are used for specific applications, like educational apps, mobility apps, medical apps, your Fitbit trackers, whatever you're using, they're on your phone and that you're interfacing with. So this is the lasagna system. But vertically integrated is the spaghetti layer. And then we're talking about the closed corporate stacks that are offered to us by big tech corporations. So here we have the one spaghetti string from Google, the Google stack. It's a vertically integrated stack, and I will give you an example of how this works. By the way, I see some of you taking pictures. I will make the slides available open, as an open data gesture to you in the PDF later. So in this stack, what you're seeing, well, let me give you an example to show how it works. If you go to a school, I just showed you that school with a Google sign, or with if you enter such a school, what happens is those schools buy Chrome laptops, right? They're actually offered very cheaply, like around 200 euros in the Netherlands, but they're preloaded with a lot of software that you can't take off. They're mandatory. You have to use them. And that software is listed there. So actually you buy into the layers, into the infrastructure, which is you pretty much hook onto Azure for all the storage of your data, but you're also preloaded with Google Analytics, with YouTube, with particularly the Google ID is very interesting here. Actually, in Holland, parents have to sign away the right to use Google ID because it's not allowed according to the GDPR. So there's this whole hassle about how do we get children into the stack, right? And then, of course, Google Classroom is one of the most widely available and most used applications that schools are using. So this is the spaghetti layer from the Google point of view. Now we go to the Microsoft point of view, and I've integrated AI tools here to show you how, this happens very gradually, but also almost unnoticeably, how the AI tools of the past few years are integrated in this stack, in the Microsoft stack. Now, most of you will probably know that OpenAI, actually Microsoft has 50% of the shares of OpenAI. So it shouldn't surprise you that, for instance, ChatGPT is now built into most of the school systems that are offered to schools. So here, same principle of the spaghetti layer, the vertical integration of these services. In the bottom is that, well, of course, Google and Microsoft are two of the few who have hyperscalers that can actually have the compute power to train generative AI, for all kinds of purposes. So when you enter into the Microsoft system, you actually enter into that infrastructure as a service. But you also buy into these days into the platform service layer. And very recently, GPT-4 of Microsoft is now built into, for instance, its search engines. It's still underway, this transformation, into search, into chat services, into voice assistants. And now Copilot of Microsoft is built into all of these generic services, including Microsoft 365. It happens as we speak, so I can't really tell where it is leading us. I know that there are a couple of court cases currently running from the educational institutions against Microsoft for making these software sort of integrative, where you don't have a choice if you want to opt out. Said in other words, you cannot opt out if you don't want to use generative AI. So you have to deal with what is offered. And by the way, those licenses that you buy are going up tremendously. Well, now they will be offered, at very reasonable prices. But I think it was recently Denmark that already announced that it's going to downscale on buying Microsoft services for all kinds of government services because the license fees have gone up, I think 180% over the past years. And that will not stop there. Okay, so this is, the Microsoft stack and how these kind of spaghetti stacks expand the power of big tech companies and dependence on their systems. Now, returning to my question, how dependent has Europe become of the American ecosystem? Well, very dependent. And if you look here, what this is showing is the power concentration by nation. And if you look, these are sort of, the lasagna layers, but more spelled out, like in different, even more layers. What you're seeing is that the Americans are dominating pretty much all of the layers. And sometimes it's just like in cloud services, it's simply just the US and China. I know Europe has a few cloud services, and it's actually being promoted right now to start European hyperscalers. But it's, basically a field that is completely dominated by Americans and Chinese. As a Dutch person, I have to point out, of course, that we have one particular strength in the Netherlands. Most of you will not know it as a house. It's not a household name, but ASML is one of the few very big machine manufacturers, not chip manufacturers, but machine manufacturers that control a pretty big part of that market. So, these are my only few words of Dutch national pride today. There's a few German pride that I can point out. That is mostly Bosch and Siemens. So there's a few tiny spots of European hope there, but mostly it is, dominated by Americans and Chinese. So coming back to my concerns about the European digital space, there's three things I want to point out. Power concentration by big tech platforms and infrastructures threatens Europe's digital sovereignty and data safety. I use the word sovereignty here because it pertains to state actors. That is how you use the word sovereignty in more, governance language. Secondly, dependence on those global platform ecosystems hamper autonomy of public organizations, for instance, universities, as guardians of public values. And here I use the word autonomy because for institutions like universities or libraries, we talk about autonomy instead of sovereignty, which pertains to state actors. I'll return to that later. And finally, big tech hampers innovation, economic investments, consumer protection, and attraction of talent in private and public sectors. That last thing, the attraction of talent, I've talked to master students over the past few months, and some of them have told me, well, I could go work for the IT services of my university because they have an ad in the paper right now, but they're basically looking for a Microsoft service agent. Then if I would like to do that, I might as well go to Microsoft straight away because they would pay me twice as much. And that is probably one of the biggest problems that the public sector has. It doesn't attract talent. It can't compete because it's basically trying to buy into the systems that are provided for them. So I'm going to get myself some water. What we have seen in Europe is increasing calls for more sovereignty and for more autonomy from institutions. But the call for digital independence should not come out of geopolitical fear. And now we're coming to this left article I think it's from the New York Times, that points out that Trump is threatening to cut off the EU if it's actually threatening or if it tries to challenge tech dominance. And secondly, it shouldn't come out of economic fear. And then I refer to Mario Draghi's report on European competitiveness that has been lagging he's completely right. But it shouldn't be just out of economic interest that we're doing this. It actually, our whole existence as a democratic society, as a democratic nation, as a democratic continent, depends on being more independent in terms of digital infrastructure. So what makes the European system different from the US and China, and how can we deal with this infrastructural imposition of values on our European system? So now I come to the topic of public values and actors. When we talk about public values, we often reduce our concerns with regards to digital space to two values: privacy and security. And those values, are they're very important. They're very significant. But usually, and that is interesting, America will use the term security a lot, and Europe the word privacy. So an example, when DeepSeek, the Chinese, the Chinese challenger of ChatGPT, entered the scene like a year and a half ago now, what the US did is it emphasized safety and security. You see that in the left article. In Europe, we were really doting on privacy. And so the privacy security standoff basically sort of dominates our whole talk about public values. Whereas I think that there are many more public values that are at stake besides those two. Very important, privacy and security, but there are a lot more. So what kind of public values do I think are relevant to European democracies? On your left-hand side, you see, of course, privacy and security, but also transparency and accuracy. Accuracy, we don't want fake news, misinformation, pollution to sort of drive our internet. We want to have, tools for confirming accuracy of information. So that's a very important value. And then on the other side, the right-hand side, you see public values that pertain to democratic society as a whole. We want to, in our infrastructure, digital infrastructure, we expect fairness, not just in terms of fair competition, but also we expect inclusiveness in terms of non-discrimination. We have to abide by the law. We also expect, and I think that's a very valid public value, autonomy. As teachers, for instance, we should be able to decide our own choices on the internet and not just succumb to the kind of public values dictated by a system. We should be held accountable for what we do. If we cannot be held accountable because any kind of chatbot is doing things that are totally intransparent, that's a public value we need to take into account. Of course, democratic control is a very important value. And last but not least, sustainability. And here, we get to the issue of how much energy, for instance, does an AI chatbot use? Now that it's built into, for instance, a search engine, what we're seeing is that with each search that we're performing on the internet, it takes 20 times as much energy than when you just perform a search on Google or on Bing. So sustainability is very much on our mind. If we want to achieve those goals in 2015, which are already sort of going down the drain if I watch the news every day, we have to be aware of how sustainable we can make those infrastructures. So public values are not fixed entity. They're a balancing act. They're constantly negotiated from the European Parliament to schools. We constantly negotiate public values. You can't go to a store and buy them off the shelf. Simply, those are the values, the norms that you're negotiated in your immediate public context. Now, who is involved in negotiation? And here I resort to one of the slides that I use for Political Economy 101, basically. So it's a very basic slide. What are the kind of actors engaged in that balancing act, which is very typical for Europe? That's what we have called the Rhineland model, which is basically achieving a balance between market, state, and civil society actors. Market actors are, 95% dominant in the United States. State is, 100% China. And the European system is a lot about what you find in the middle, a multi-stakeholder organization that ideally achieves this balance between what market actors do, corporations, and civil society. But the problem is with civil society actors, they don't own the resources that are that go into that digital infrastructure. In fact, there are no digital services of any significance that are owned by civil society. I will come to Nextcloud later. It doesn't pop up on my screen now, but I will pop up later. So with digital infrastructures that are increasingly defined by global markets and states, companies gain and wield enormous power over state democracies. So if civil society actors should do anything, it is to have some impact on democracy, but they have very little acting power in the digital ecosystem. So basically what, we need to ask is if we need, the European Union is now becoming increasingly aware that to protect public values and principle, they have to go to the core of that infrastructural system. So sovereignty and autonomy and independence, it really requires a very serious approach to all three layers of that stack. And that is what Europe is now asking itself, like, who should act? How can we act in the interest of our democracy? Can we use protective mechanisms or can we use offensive tools? How can Europe basically govern its digital societies? And I will get to that in just a second. But how do we look at European governance? So my next question, that's the last question I want to raise for today, is what can European states and civil society actors, important in Europe, what can they do to govern digital society based on public values and protect the democracies? And I have four they're not exhaustive, but I have chosen 4 different strategies that I would like to discuss with you today. Regulate, negotiate, invest, and stimulate, from the different levels. And there's this very strong myth that has been, circulating, and not just in Europe, but pretty much globally. That myth is that, well, the US innovates, China imitates, Europe, only thing they can do is regulate. I totally disagree with that myth, and I would like to, sort of show you why. I think it's unfair. I think it's sort of an indication of what Europe should do. Europe should indeed innovate, but by implementing regulation, you can also force your own industry to become more innovative, right? You shouldn't shy away from regulation. You can do both regulate. You can both regulate and innovate. And on that notion, I would like to talk a little bit about each of those strategic principles that I would like you to pay attention to. There's many regulatory, so of course, Europe is about regulation. And I wouldn't think that is a bad thing. You have, we can have a whole discussion on what good regulation is, but many regulatory frameworks that have been launched over the past 7 years, since 2018, have been very effective and very influential in Europe. The GDPR, for instance, in terms of privacy, we have the DSA, DMA in terms of controlling data portability, platform interoperability. We have DORA, which is about standards for security. More recently, we've had the AI Act, which was pretty much influenced by a lot of lobbyists from the big tech industry. And if I just opened the newspaper this morning, and what did I read? They're trying, those same companies who acted as co-authors for the AI Act are now trying to push for deregulation. So they were first in the business of co-authoring it, and now they're in the business of pushing for deregulation. So I think regulation is a very important thing to do for Europe, but enforcement is often underfunded and sort of, in the face of that gigantic lobbying power, it's very small. What can we do, in Europe? We can negotiate, and that is some strategy I would like to point out. And here, well, this is my only other thing of Dutch pride. Maybe I have one more, but anyway. We shouldn't just regulate, but also negotiate and enforce compliance. And this is where we can put pressure from civil society. And that is what we did in the Netherlands. In 2023, Google, Microsoft, and Zoom all violated the GDPR by using student data. I will not go into details, but what the Dutch educational sector did, not just one school or one university, but the entire sector of education, they rallied together to file a DPIA with the state, Data Protection Impact Assessment. And they won in court. They even won in the higher court. And the Google and both Google and Microsoft had to either change their conditions or they would be prohibited from entering school systems as of September 1st. And that was the message they got received in July. As of September 1st, they had changed all their conditions and complied with the GDPR. Now, this was a big victory, and it was actually featured on the front page of the New York Times. So the only time my country featured on the front page of the New York Times, it must have been really something. Why was that something? Because it wasn't just the Dutch schools that Microsoft is, they don't give a damn about a few Dutch schools. They don't care. They couldn't care less. But that whole ruling was taken to Brussels and was, sort of taken, that you could see that as one of the Brussels effects, right? Once it happens in one country, it can happen in all of Europe. So they changed it very rapidly. Apparently they could change it in 3 weeks. So what was the problem in the first place? Big thing. They are now actually doing the same thing for the implementation of Copilot in educational software, which is, another major hassle. What can Europe do? It can invest in funding and principles. And currently, as you probably know, the US is pumping billions of public funding in AI infrastructure, basically state subsidies for big tech. And the EU is, sometimes trying to imitate the US, not regulate, but also imitate the US by doing the same thing, putting a lot of funding into state funding into corporate infrastructures. And that goes, of course, straight to the US companies. So if I were a part of the EU, of the EC, I would not do that. Instead, I think, the Europe should not only compete in terms of euros or economic value, but in terms of quality, putting public value-based infrastructure first, and also invest in principles. And this is what I would call conditional innovation that benefits people, not corporations, that benefits civilians, public, rather than just tech companies. So on the right-hand side, you see an article in Tech Policy Review that I just published last month with one of my postdocs, Rianne Riemens. It's called Bigger and Faster or Better and Greener. And basically the argument is that the EU needs to invest on its own conditions. Sustainable AI, not faster, but better. Greener, not bigger. We always talk about the global scale. Why can't we develop AI that is much more contextualized? I'll return to that in a second. So what are those principles that you can base innovation on here? I listed 5. They're not exhaustive, but that public stack principle, public stack could be based on principles like interoperability, data portability, data integrity. We want our data to be, we want to have control over it, open standards and open source, and of course, sustainability, as I just explained. And for those values, I refer to an article by Mariana Mazzucato, which is on DPI, digital public infrastructure and public values. So she talks a lot about what are the conditions, are the conditions we can put as for return on investment, right? What can Europe do? Stimulate diversity, stimulate alternative stacks. Total independence from big tech will be impossible, I think, but stimulating alternative stacks of interoperable services and infrastructure, that might be a very good idea. Ideal at this moment because it doesn't, it's not materializing yet, but the Eurostack, for instance, is one of these broad, independent, non-lobby movements that is pushing the European Parliament and the European Commission to work towards sovereign tech infrastructure, reached through, a multi-stakeholders organization. It's just an idea. It's not materialized yet, but we have to start with ideas, right? I want to be, put in a bit of optimism here because it's not that we cannot do anything. We can do something, but we need to start with the right ideas. What can civil society actors do? And now I sort of resort to my own context, the Dutch context, because I don't know much about the German situation. But an example, in the Netherlands, we have a civil society organization called the WAAG, and they're promoting alternatives for big tech tools. So they give you, alternatives for Signal for WhatsApp, Mastodon for X, Fairphone for iPhone, Element for Slack, Solid for AWS, Nextcloud is here instead of Microsoft 365 and Drive. So it's not just a cloud service, but it's actually, I just heard Bremen is now onto Nextcloud. I picked that up and I have to compliment you because Germany has more than 50 universities who are now using Nextcloud. Whereas my own country, the Netherlands, has just started. It's an experiment with 5 universities with Nextcloud. We're getting there, hopefully, but it's still in its infancy. Of course, there's major incentives to do so. We want to use open source. It's free or free use, but there's also major shortcomings. We have very little interoperability, not much network effects yet. Well, that's the whole thing. You can start with your own autonomy strategy, but you cannot do autonomy all by yourself. It's sort of an ironic thing, but you can't do that. You need a whole support system, and you need other people to buy into that system. There's no coordinated efforts yet, not many, but there's good beginnings. And the Fediverse and the Eurostack are a few of those beginnings. Now, I won't dwell on this. I could talk for hours about just this slide. It's an alternative public stack infrastructure that we're trying to build in the Netherlands. It has many elements to it where I've been personally involved in its, trying to do fundraising or trying to distribute it among civil society actors. Some were very successful, others have completely failed, and that is part of that experimental landscape. It's very difficult, one thing I would like to point out is GPT-NL, which is an interesting attempt to train GPT for the Dutch language. And it was subsidized by the state. And now we just heard last week that in Groningen, very close to Bremen, there will be one of the few AI training facilities, and it just got funded by the EU. I think there was like $200 million euro involved. So this is very difficult and yet essential. We cannot, people often ask me, don't you get discouraged? This will never work. It will never become as powerful as Microsoft or Google. No, of course not. But that's not what I'm advocating. I'm not advocating that we should become bigger and faster. No, it's the other way around. We should become smarter, and maybe we should become smaller. But that is an incentive to think about those public values before you implement them in a system. So basically, my answer will be, we cannot afford to not do this, right? We have to invest in alternatives, if only to learn how we want to, basically design and be the architects of such a system. So the public stack model leads to a number of recommendations, and these are my two last slides. First, my recommendations to the EU and the national level. To Europe, regulate and innovate on the basis of public values. I just argued that, right? State governments promote digital sovereignty by investing in public infrastructure. The Dutch just did in that AI facility in Groningen. Enhance innovation power and user choice by stimulating alternative services and platforms. Choice is a very important term here. We need to have choice. If we're hooked onto one system, cannot use another, it will never work, it will never happen. And finally, recommendations to civil society. And that is, a very strong appeal to people like you, universities as autonomous organizations, to insist on public values to be at the core, the heart of their institution. Collaborate at sectoral levels in order to innovate. If you don't get together, if you don't collaborate, you are, meat for the big tech corporations. Invest and negotiate, and the proposals should be staked in public values as vis-a-vis, commercial values, efficiency, convenience, etc. Support user experiments with alternative platforms. All of these platforms are, will not flourish if we don't use them. If we don't use them, we cannot further emulate them or prepare for their bright futures. And develop a strategy for creating an independent open infrastructure or public stack. Now, all of these combined will lead to my sort of ideal, in the cloud. Europe really needs to cement its public values and public spaces in the architectural design and governance of platform ecosystems to secure, fair, democratic, and open digital societies. And on that note, I would like to close my presentation. Thank you.